Hello, Internet. It's Daniel here again with Driving and Dragons, and I'm going to do another reaction to good old Condor DM. Now, I'm hoping that I'm actually going to have some things to agree with him on this time, seeing as how my last video was typical of a video responding to him, um, trashing some of his bad faith arguments. But in this case, he's talking about, can you fix 5e D&D? Now, I'm not a fan of 5e at all, and I'm kind of looking forward to see what he has to say. I know he's a 2e guy, and he has this idea that all games are broken, which I don't agree with, but um, I do agree with some of the points he makes to support that. And let's see what he has to say about 5e and what we might agree with him on there. So let's go ahead and get cracking.
Do you know what the issue is with trying to fix 5e Dungeons and Dragons? Well, it comes down to their player base. There's a small minority that are open-minded, but over 90% of players, in my experience, from in person to talking to them online, over 90% of players seem to be opposed to host rules. Like,
I kind of agree with him there to a certain extent. I'm going to let him finish his point here in a second, but I do think the player base is the issue. That said, I don't think it's so much the player base is the issue because they don't want to let in house rules or they want to be excessively rules as written. When they say that, they really mean rules by the book, not necessarily rules as written, because rules as written says Dungeon Master's discretion. But I don't know that I've seen a lot of huge opposition to homebrew, but the player base is predominantly the issue. And in my experience and what I've seen and in all the arguments I see online, the issue is really because within the Dungeons and Dragons space, the hobby has shifted towards a new player base that is very player first. The game master, or I guess in this case, the dungeon master, is no longer treated as a player anymore. They're almost treated as an employee or something that is part of the game you have. They're like a service provider. And the enjoyment of the game master, the treating him as another player at the table, has been put to the wayside, where the dungeon master is generally seen more as subservient to the players. And you've got this obsessive, I've done videos on it multiple times. I'll probably do another one on it at some point. I call it the curse of the entitled player base, where, even to the stupid point where I've seen people actually try and argue that killing a player's character without permission is somehow a violation of player agency. But let's see what he's talking about. He's talking about open-mindedness, not wanting to go rules as written. Let's see what the rest of his point is on that as far as the player base.
Like the Bro OSR, they pitch raw. They push rules as written. Well, if they were looking for allies, they would find it in the majority of 5e players. Oh, hey, you fixed 5e. Now it's time to go recruit. But guess what? The people that are having a harder time recruiting for the old school D&D games, well, they're out recruiting you. Why? Because over 90% of the players will look at your so-called fixed 5e and they'll walk away. They won't join your game. So you know how they tell you, if you go pitch a 5e game, you'll fill it up in no time. Well, that's only if you're really pitching it raw. And what about going back to the core? Just, stick to the core books. No, they don't want that. Most 5e players want all that extended stuff. They want a bunch of it. And if you're not offering it, they're gone.
He's definitely right in some of this. Now, the OSR, one of the biggest problems with it doesn't really have to do with not wanting to, the big disconnect between the OSR and 5e in general is not a divide over like rules as written or game rules. It's a divide over philosophy, over it's almost a culture war. in microcosm, because the OSR tends to skew older, and older tends to skew more conservative, especially socially. The 5e player base tends to skew very much in the weeb animu genre. It tends to skew far more socially progressive. You can see this in things like the unbelievably stupid wheelchair dungeon crap and the let's get rid of races and the other stupidity they've come up with. But also the OSR, a core part of why the OSR likes the older games in a lot of cases comes down to character death. They want a more lethal, gritty, realistic game, a quote-unquote harder game, if you will, whereas the newer player base wants more of a medieval fantasy, high magic superhero game. And that's where your real impasse comes from. It doesn't matter about rules as written or anything when it comes to becoming allies on that. It comes to the fact that the 5e player wants to have 9 death saves and start the game off with a grand sword of artifact grand poobah mastery, flaming death sphere, and wants to be a half kitsune, half tiefling, half dragon, half orc, half elf, mega super character that was the child of a god and starts with extra levels because of it. And the OSR player says, play a human fighter. Play a human wizard and hope to God your ass doesn't die for the first 7 levels while you're getting to the point where you're actually really of use to the party. So that's really where a bunch of that disconnect comes from. And you're not going to get, that's not an impasse that's going to be met. You're going to have players that will step away from that. He is absolutely correct in the fact that most of them want to have all the new books. But it's for the same reason. It's because Wizards of the Coast is monetizing power creep. The reason you go buy the new books is because the stuff that's in the new books is objectively better and more powerful from a game rules perspective than the previous books. So the players want to have the new stuff because they want to be more powerful and harder to kill. And that also kind of goes into why they tend to focus so heavily on a explicitly rules as written in the book approach, because the 90% of home brewing that's going to happen in most games is going to be in the name of balancing things out and making them make more sense. It doesn't help you to have this new super badass ability that's objectively better than everything else that came before it if your DM just goes in and homebrews it back into balance with the rest of everything else, or homebrews the old stuff up to where it catches up to that power creep. It eliminates that power fantasy that those newer players tend to want.
To really know this, you have to be out there in the hobby, like meeting with all kinds of different players, different dungeon masters of all these 5e games that are going on. And they tell you that most players, this is what 5e DMs tell me, the majority of players, if they make certain changes, won't join their game. They'll have as much trouble as people are trying to recruit for way less popular games, right? Almost to the point those games are unpopular. But those people are competing with a 5e DM who comes in having a fixed game, or a game with one too many host rules, or they only use the core. So they're sitting on the side looking for players just like everyone else. And yeah, there's some truth to it. If you're just going to run 5e as it is, and you're willing to, accept a lot of the extended stuff that has come out, you can fill your table up in no time.
I think he's downplaying a little bit the scope of 5e here. Even with an adjusted or balanced out or homebrewed 5e game, unless you get to the point where you have a lot of 5e, or like you said, you are truly just running core and you're not allowing any additional supplemental material, you're not going to get anywhere near to the point where you're having a harder time filling that table than, say, a Call of Cthulhu table. And that's just because there's such a large player base for 5e. And another part of it, I think, also comes into when you start looking at some of the VTTs, like especially like D&D Beyond and stuff. If you've paid money to have these books and to have these supplementary materials in the game, then of course you're going to want them because you spent money on them. And it kind of feels a little different online than it did when we just had a giant stack of books. He keeps using a 90% number. He's pulling that out of his ass. There's no actual study or survey on that, but he is absolutely correct. It is a majority of 5e players you're going to run across this. I'm still not hearing how he thinks he's going to fix 5e, but we'll see what comes up.
But if you try something other than that, you have just as much trouble, in most cases, filling your game as any other game master of any other system. In person, I know well over 20 different DMs that run 5e, and they keep me informed on all this stuff all the time. And I know a ton of players in person that play 5e, and I actually talk to a lot of 5e players on the internet. It's not even me saying most of this. Like, most of the opinions that I'm sharing here about 5e players not being open-minded, it comes from 5e dungeon masters, both in person and online. This is what they tell me. And they're very open about this stuff. And if you go to 5e gamers, like players in that, they don't deny this. Actually, they're usually the ones bringing this up. There's a lot of people that simply won't go play an alternative version of 5e. And it doesn't take much for them to see it as an alternative version. Like, you don't offer Dragonborn, they're gone. That's it. You can't fill up your table in most cases. I have not met a 5e player that tells me they wouldn't play with someone from the old school. And I try to tell them a lot of the old school guys would game with you if you would let them make a change to the game, and they would come game with you. They just don't like certain elements of, the game, like a 5e. So they want to make changes. Well, these guys are completely open to playing with those older grognards. They're just not open to the changes. And so they understand that there is no meat in the middle. Most of the older guys don't like the game as it is, and most of the newer guys like the game as it is. That's a clash, right? And they don't like the new guys don't like just the core 5e. They like the whole package. They might not like every strip that's coming out, every piece that's coming out. They're not all political activists, and they're not all on the left or care about politics or anything like that, right? They don't like some of the stuff, but they do like the mechanics. They like all the different species, races, whatever the fuck you want to call it. They like all that stuff. And even if they don't take the options, and this is what weirds me out, a lot of them will play human characters. But if you don't offer Dragonborn, even though they're going to play the human character, they're out. Almost all of them are out. Wizards.
He's got a good point there. And that goes right back to what I said before when it comes to the new player base about that entitled player mentality. Just because I'm not going to use this option doesn't mean you're allowed to take it away from me. And it does extend to a ridiculous length. Now, I believe that some of that actually comes into a stand-in. I'm trying to remember the exact term for it, but it's basically a litmus test for the dungeon master. I don't really care, for instance, let's say I'm a player, 5e player, and I'm coming in. I'm not going to play Dragonborn. I don't care about Dragonborn. I actually don't like Dragonborn. This dungeon master isn't going to allow Dragonborn. You would think, okay, awesome, good for me. However, I'm using this as a litmus test. He doesn't allow Dragonborn. That means he's going to tell me no. He is going to disallow something I want at some point, and he is going to take away my agency, because player agency is the most abusively misdefined word in the current tabletop role-playing game space, especially in 5e Dungeons & Dragons, without a doubt.
Wizards of the Coast have produced a mindset in the majority of their gamers, their players, their dungeon masters, that is outright poisonous to the hobby.
It's a home run on that one. Got to agree with that exact statement, that sentence he just said, that Wizards of the Coast has created this mentality in players and dungeon masters that is outright poisonous to the hobby. Said it 100,000 times. Wizards of the Coast has created a customer base, but that customer base is toxic to the hobby. Now, I will say this: I don't think that is as pervasive with dungeon masters, especially dungeon masters that came into 5e from previous editions of the game or who play other systems. But your 5e dungeon master who started in 5e, came up in 5e, and has always been 5e, a lot of them also share it and they spread the same crap. And you actually see other YouTube channels also share the same garbage when it comes to the entitlement mentality.
It is destructive to the hobby. What it does is it allows them to maintain these people in their circle so they can keep getting money off of them, and it works. It destroys the hobby, but it lets them maintain a situation where they keep having money come in. Because if they don't have people hooked on their game in this way with the mindset of staying to their game and not going to other games, well, given all the bad news and press, they would cave in. Like they would get destroyed. A lot of people would take their money and go elsewhere. But they have brainwashed a lot of their players by giving them what they want. You know, here's what you want. Even if it doesn't work, we're giving you what you want, so you keep coming back and giving us the money. And they have made this work for them perfectly. But that means it hurts us. And in my opinion, if you stay in their zone, like you try to fix their 5e or you try to actually help that along, you're doing nothing good for the hobby.
There's a point where I'm going to disagree with Condor pretty heavily on this. 5e is not broken. The system does exactly what it's supposed to do. It doesn't need to be fixed. Now, when you start trying to correct it to make it behave differently, when you start trying to go in and make it more deadly and adjust it in certain ways, you are going to lose a lot of that player base because it is designed to appeal to a specific mentality. That mentality is toxic to the hobby. It is toxic to the community. It is just a toxic philosophy in life in general, outside of the gaming space entirely. The entitlement mentality is one of the most devastating things in our society today. But the idea that you are fixing 5e is really loaded language that is not correct. It's also not how I would approach somebody if I was going to run, say I was going to run a 5e adjacent game like Everyday Heroes or something that's based on the 5e system. Or say I was going to run 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. I would not go to a player and say, oh, I'm fixing it. I would say, hey, I'm making some adjustments to fit this particular play style. Because the fact of the matter is that I can't stand 5th edition, but 5th edition is not a broken game. 5th edition is a system that behaves precisely as designed and is actually relatively refined in that regard. So just, my 2 cents, if you were going to try and talk 5th edition players into trying more things or into trying some more, like more lethal gameplay, for instance, I would never say I'm fixing 5th edition because it's busted or it's broken. I would say I'm making adjustments for a specific play style because the game isn't broken. It can just be altered or upgraded.
My suggestion would be to tell people to get the fuck away from WotC and all their games. I don't want to help 5e. I don't want to help the madness. I want the poison to go away. I want to get rid of the scam, but it's not going away. And most people are confused about what's really going on. They don't understand that, the 5e gimmick is no good. It's really no good. It's pushing politics. It's pushing an extreme political ideology. And on top of that, it is brainwashing, poisoning the minds of the people that play that game to the point they're not open to try other things. And this is not just regular normies being poisoned by this. I'm encountering other geeks that should be in the hobby, but they've been brainwashed by WotC, right? And they're not open-minded. And these are nerds. These are nerds that should be with us.
you can call this a chicken or the egg thing. WotC, while highly political and very, very, very friendly towards a pretty leftist social agenda, WotC is not pushing politics. Politics is pushing WotC. What's happening is Wizards of the Coast is just very easily folding and capitulating in order to pander to the player base that they've already brought in. They've brought in a leftist or a left-leaning political player base, and that's always been there. It's never been not there. It's just that they've pandered hard, and the 5e system never really appealed to the more conservative mindset anyway, or even the more neutral mindset, because that more centerist mindset's actually getting pushed out by the pandering. This is kind of like the Bud Light boycott. It's kind of like the Target boycott. You pander hard enough, and you're going to get blowback, and you're going to stop seeing people. And what's going to end up is, like I said, chicken or the egg. Was the player base hyper leftist and WotC just catered to them, or was the player base more balanced and then WotC pushed them that way? I don't think it's either one. I think you had a left-leaning, you had a relatively centerist, almost apolitical player base in a lot of ways, and you had a lot more balance. The rash of new players brought in were far more left-leaning. Then the pandering started pushing out what was left of the more centerist and right-leaning players, and you've been left with the multicolor-haired, pixie cut pronouns in your bio group is what's been left there. Though I will say this, the creative types that create these games, I'm just point this out, they've been pretty left-leaning since the beginning. It's not a new phenomenon. Not at all. I got into an argument with a former Chaosium executive editor just a few weeks ago about AI art, and the dude is a raging leftist, and he's not. That's not uncommon. And Wizards of the Coast, of course, is going to hire based on that before anything else. You're not going to find any conservatives at Wizards of the Coast, at least not in the game design area. But that all said, going back to it, Wizards of the Coast, it's not Wizards of the Coast ramming this stuff down. And while I do think Wizards of the Coast needs to be boycotted out of existence, like I said, just like Target, just like Bud Light, you take it a bridge too far, and certain people start saying, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. We're not buying this anymore. And that should happen to Wizards of the Coast. But what should happen is Wizards of the Coast should be eventually forced to unload Dungeons and Dragons to another publisher that can put out a better product, and then maybe brought it back. What we don't need is for Dungeons and Dragons to get killed off or pushed out, and for us to all go back to second edition or first edition or third edition to the old stuff that's out of print. Because if you don't have new stuff coming into the hobby and you don't have a healthy publishing arm, you will eventually see a nadir in the hobby, which is not something we want.
Right? That we should be talking to. And there's lots of them. So don't just think it's the normies who have been caught up. A lot of our people have been caught up in it, right? And I count them as our people. Fellow nerds that should be in the hobby. And en masse, they're coming in and they're getting stuck in 5e. And anytime you give you lean towards 5e or talk about it in a positive way or trying to fix it, you're doing no good. You're not helping them. You're making it worse. I don't want to fix 5e. I want everyone, right, who wants a good experience in this hobby to get the fuck away from that trash. It's not that it's a bad game overall, right? There are certain elements of it that if you tear away, you can make a good game. But you're being brainwashed, and you're having politics shoved down your throat through the game. Maybe not through the core books, but through the game, through WotC, and they're doing it, and it's working. So we can't just sit back and pretend that this isn't happening. Now, I'm not expecting anyone who listens to this video to have to care about these things. Go game if you want, right? But if you do, well, then here, I made this video because I do, right? And if we're on the same page, let's push back against this together. If you don't care, go play the game. And if you like 5e and you don't care for what I have to say, fair enough. I still have advice videos. Go check those out. They might help you. This might not be your, cup of tea, right? Anyway, for now, take care.
All right. So largely I agree with a lot of what he said. I think he misses the ball on a few things. Definitely misses the mark on whether or not the player base was corrupted or if it was a corrupt group brought in that then later was pandered to. I think he gives WotC more credit for their influence than they actually deserve in this case. I think he's kind of wrong. Like I hate the can you fix 5e language. 5th edition is not 4th edition. 4th edition was a bad game. It was a bad, poorly designed, poorly set up game that was trying to behave like a game. It basically was falsely imposing limitations on the game to make it more like a video game. Whereas if a video game existed in a perfect universe with like Star Trek level technology, you wouldn't have those limitations. The limitations are there because of the limitations of what we can do with a computer program and a console and a computer. The limitations are not there because the programmers really want them to be there. And you don't have that issue with tabletop games. So 4th edition was kind of broken. But 5th edition is not a broken game. It does exactly what it's supposed to, and it does not need fixing. But that said, the language and mentality of fixing 5e actually would turn off 5e players if you're trying to get them to come over. Because to them, it's not broken. They like it. So I know it's semantics, but there's a language thing there. It needs to be an idea of adjusting the system. Now, a big place I think he's missing, I agree with not being part of their ecosystem. Don't be part of D&D Beyond. Don't be scrambling for their newest releases or anything like that. He is absolutely correct in the fact that the newer books do have more crap that they're trying to push, but that's because they're trying to pander. That's why they're pandering harder and harder. 5th edition Dark Sun could have happened if it was their first supplemental book. It'll never happen now because there's no way they will introduce the concept of slavery into 5th edition because they got to pander so hard at this point because they've run off enough of their moderate player base that all they have left are the people who are professionally offended. But the whole concept of, hey, run away from it, get out of it now, I agree with not paying WotC, not being part of their ecosystem, not buying. But playing stuff that you already have, you can divorce your game entirely from all WotC influence if you're walking over here and you're playing Curse of Strahd with your group of friends at the house. And then, of course, there's the other 5e adjustments and stuff, like I mentioned earlier, Everyday Heroes, which is like an action movie game that looks pretty interesting and uses the 5th edition mechanics. So I guess there is, like I said, I picked this video based on the title. I hadn't seen it before, but I figured that this might be someplace where I would be more in line with what he had to say, just because I don't want to put out a video where I respond to somebody and just trash them down because of their poorly formed arguments. And like his last video where he was just so far off base, it was almost comical, without turning around and seeing if there is some place where there's some value that can be added, or where there's a rational. I don't want to just push somebody in some bad light. But I think this is about as close to agreeing with Condor as I'm going to get. You tell me what you think in the comment section below. Like, share, and subscribe. And I really look forward to seeing you guys next time.